Amatak This is Nick Estes here on the Red Nation podcast. We are live streaming today with Justin Podur. We're also cross live streaming on East is the Podcast. I made a really off-color joke before we got on this call about that. I won't repeat it here, but nonetheless, welcome. That's why Justin is cracking up right now.
It was off mic. It was off. It wasn't a hot mic. The mics weren't hot.
Welcome to the podcast, Justin. Maybe you could start by introducing yourself, where you're calling from, and talk about your own project, the Anti-Empire Project.
Okay, thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm a long-time fan of Red Nation. My name's Justin. I'm in Toronto, which is on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, and stolen like every other square inch of this continent by settler colonists from the Anglo-Americas. So that what I've been doing for the past couple of years, and it's been a couple of years, is it's now weekly. It was probably 2 or 3 times a week. I've been doing a report on the military situation of the war on Gaza, the genocide, and the regional wars that have started and paused and continued. So the entire regional war I've been covering on my channel, the Anti-Empire Project, which is just, if you're searching on YouTube, it's just YouTube/my name, Justin Podur. And I'm on Twitter and wherever else as well. So that's relevant to what we're talking about today. That's what I've been doing. And then in terms of today and why I think we're talking today is because over these 2 years and before, because I've been studying Israel, Palestine since 2000. So 25 years now. I've been doing this and, solidarity with Palestinians. I was in the West Bank in Gaza with the International Solidarity Movement, the ISM, a nonviolent movement, in 2002. And I have been part of whatever I could be here to support the Palestinian cause since then. And so I have at various moments studied the kind of religious apocalyptic Armageddon aspects of this conflict. And I grew up, we can get more into this later, but I grew up in a Catholic family. I went to a Catholic school in a suburb of Toronto called Mississauga, and I never resonated with that religious framework or any, and I got into science, and I've never left that scientific perspective. And so I've read various critiques, like all the Why I'm an Atheist kinds of literatures, and I've always looked at religious texts from that kind of perspective. And so we'll get into that. But now, over the past since 2000, over the past 25 years, let's say, I've come to realize the importance of these texts and the importance of this area in motivating what Israel is doing and what Israel's supporters are doing and what they're really after. My own worldview is very scientific, very strategic, and very materialist. And so I have this weakness, and I've come to realize that I have this analytical weakness because a lot of the people that are moving the pieces on this board are actually motivated by what I would call irrational motivations and religious ones.
Yeah, thanks for that. We just did a podcast with on my other show, Red Scare, with Adnan Hussein, and we talked about indigenous spirituality and anti-colonial resistance and how spiritual movements, really influence and provide, I guess, that intangible element of like motivating and inspiring people to resist and to, overthrow the oppressor, using these kind of terms. And this one, this inspiration for this podcast actually came from one of your sit reps where you did talk about the Book of Joshua specifically. And this has been mentioned several times in reference to the recent genocidal war in Gaza by Zionists, proponents of genocide, the leaders of the Zionist entity called Israel. And it's also been referenced, a lot by, Christian Zionists in the United States. And I think one of the, I similar to you, I came to, Christianity. I was, obviously Christianity came to me. I didn't come to Christianity, but reading the Bible, I remember reading the Old Testament, and it was just like, wow, God was really, he was very genocidal. He killed a lot of people and did a lot of things.
Like directly, opens up the earth and swallows them up and strikes them dead from the Ark of the Covenant. And
and as a young teenager, I remember I was in catechism or early teens, preteens, and I asked our pastor at the time, I was Episcopalian, about I was like, why would he do this? I don't understand. He's like, it's a matter of faith. And I think at that moment, it's not that I lost my faith. I just really questioned kind of the tenets of these things. And it always has existed abstractly. And for this podcast, I tried to read the Book of Joshua. I was I spent probably about 20-25 minutes, and I was like, this literally doesn't make any sense to me. So I did skim read some of the sections. I kind of pulled some of the quotes out to kind of put it into context. But really, I had this revelation, I guess, or
unintended.
Not the kind. Yeah, that's really funny. When I went to, Jerusalem, and my mother was a really devout Christian. She was very much about the Bible. And when I went there, I had this weird disconnect of this is where these stories took place, and just seeing the occupation, seeing and talking to a Palestinian archaeologist who really described the way that the old city was rearranged and reconstructed in a way to match this kind of biblical interpretation, not of ancient, Palestine, but of present day, modern 20th century, 21st century, Zionism and the narratives that were put forward. And it was just this disconnect because, my mom, all these stories, all these places are in these stories that we grew up with, these characters and everything. And so it was a very kind of alienating experience. And then it also just made me realize it's this is not a mythology. This is actually a conquest narrative. And ever since then, I've been trying to really deconstruct what that means. And when you brought that up, I think your call was so they're using the Book of Joshua as a genocidal text, the Book of Genocide, the title of this podcast. What does it mean to read this text and to really understand what they're talking about? And one of the things, one of the books you recommended reading was The Joshua Generation by Rachel Havelock. And she really goes into how it's not the ancient history, it's the modern history, right, of Ben-Gurion and the Joshua study group that he had created. So maybe we can start from that point, or should we do an overview of the Book of Joshua, what it actually says? Let's start there, and then maybe move into the modern history.
Yeah, I'd love to do it that way. And I guess I want to start with the way that I've been trying to read the Bible recently, which is I've been trying to read the Bible, and it's so hard, and I'll tell you why. But I've been trying to read the Bible, and it's so hard because I've been trying to read it as a text that was written by some people at some actual specific point who were trying to make specific points when they were writing it. So that's my big, what if the Bible was a text, like another text that people sat down and wrote, and they were making specific interventions in their own time, just like every other piece of writing ever. And so but it's the reason it's almost impossible. It's all but impossible to do that is because the historians, the professionals, the archaeologists that are in charge of this knowledge, of putting this together for you, so that you can potentially read the history of this region or of these texts, they are completely invested. This is all happening either in Zionist Israel or in Zionist history departments in the West, or in theology departments in the West. And then on the internet, there are cranks, and I call them cranks almost like including myself in this category, but it's sort of like there's this crank atheist web that I've been, lurking in to try to get a handle on what atheists, or, it might not be atheists, but it might be like what Christians think of the Jewish reading of it, or that what Jewish Talmud people think of the Christians, which is horrific, or what they either of those think of Muslim texts or Muslim readings, or what Muslims think. So if you look at what these religions are saying about each other, there's a little bit more of a tendency to believe that, oh, this was an invented story for these specific reasons, and you'll be able to get a materialist reading a little bit better. But if you look at what these religions are saying about themselves, or if you look at what Zionist like the whole concept of biblical archaeology is not a scientific field. It's not an academic. It doesn't work the way you would think an academic field works, because they're not going and saying, what happened here? Let's figure it out, and then use whatever texts we have to try to illuminate what might have happened. They're saying, oh, here's the Bible. The Bible justifies the existence of Israel. So now let's go and find texts and find archaeology and find sites that do that for us. So everything that you read is like, did Moses exist? Like, to me, obviously, no. Did the conquests, because God gives the land of the Canaanites to Joshua. That's basically the story of the book of Joshua is God says, I will give you the land of the Canaanites. There's a whole bunch of other tribes.
Joshua was like the
king, one of the kings.
Well, he was he was seen as like Moses's successor, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So there are these various kings. Joshua's one of them that follows Moses. The story of Exodus, where Moses takes the people out of Egypt. I don't, just like materially speaking, I don't believe any of this stuff happened. Not any of it. Like, I want people to understand from like, if you're looking for evidence of any of this, like from the normal way that you would look for evidence for things, there's no, it doesn't, absolutely none of this happened. When you listen to the way these people talk and the way they try to describe, oh, I think there's evidence of Exodus here. I think there's a wall that's been damaged at approximately this 1,000-year window where this might have happened. Like the stretching of the rules of evidence or logic to try to assemble a story that matches anything resembling what's in the Bible. It's totally outrageous. So I don't believe any of this happened, but like when I go and look in this crankosphere, let's call it, I've come to some rough sense of like some of these texts were happening, or like what was going on. So I believe I've come to the conclusion following one of these people. His name's Russell Grimmican. I think he died in the past few years. But he gave a case, and I want people to know I've listened to many, 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 many people make different cases. So it's not just like I came across this one video. He basically said he thinks that a group of Jewish scholars went to the Library of Alexandria and wrote at the same time the Hebrew and Greek versions of the Bible. The Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint or something, I think that's what it's pronounced. And the first 5 books of the Bible were written at the same time at the Library of Alexandria around 270 BC. In, one sitting. Not one sitting, but like by a group. And they were doing it as a lot of kind of colonies would go out from ancient Greece or here and there, and they would go and establish themselves, and they would establish villages or whatever, and they would come up with a story of their colony. They would come up with an origin story for their colony that would kind of unify the group and be part of their tradition. And that was writing this down for the Library of Alexandria was, one of the driving forces for the Jews who were, in some kind of tributary relationship to the Persians, to the Romans at various times. And so, the Roman Empire spoke Greek. What was the Roman Republic, I think, in 270 BC, and they were they were writing down some of these oral traditions because written culture was coming, was given a big boost in the ancient world by the Library of Alexandria. So it's like when you read it like this and you say, okay, and then there are details about like who Joshua was and why Joshua was interested in, why not Joshua, but why some king would have been interested in putting forward the story of conquest of Canaan, even though that, like, again, honest archaeological evidence is that this genocide that Joshua describes did not happen. There was there are always wars and conflicts, but like the people that were there, for example, around, the 0 AD or 1 AD or, 0 BC, whatever, around that time, they were Canaanite and, they were from Canaan and they were from Judah and they were, it was a mix of peoples like you would expect to see in any crossroads of any place. And so like the kind of totally out of bounds genocidal thing that happens in the book of Joshua, where the God tells the people of Israel, or Judah, I guess, to kill all of the Canaanites, kill them all, destroy their draft animals, destroy their domestic animals, kill all the children, kill all the women, wipe out the memory of them. And that's like one of the main things God wants from them. That is some political propaganda from hundreds of years BC that had some political purpose for that time that I think is largely lost to us now. So, and I think that's how all of these stories should be read. That's how all of this should be interpreted, as some kind of propaganda for that time whenever it was written. And finding out when it was written is also a very, very difficult thing to do because there's so many interests in it. So I know more about the Christian side of these things, but I think we should stick to the book of Joshua here. The book of Joshua is, I think, the most genocidal book in the Bible, but it's not, and at least, in the first 5 books of the Bible, or AKA the Torah. But I don't think that it's like the other books are also horrific. Like the things that they suggest, like the stuff God does to Egypt is also horrific. Like why does he kill all the firstborn children of Egypt? What was to pressure the Egyptians, to pressure the Pharaoh? Like what again, that story might make sense as some kind of propaganda after the fact, some kind of anti-Egypt propaganda, or like we have this very fearsome war god on our side, something like this. But these are horrific things. And I really believe people need to let these things go. I think people need to let those texts that were written in the past, go ahead, read them and learn from them, but don't follow them. Don't treat them like they're guides for how you should behave today. They're horrible as guides for how you should behave today. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that's a good overview. I think even the way, like, what's fascinating, even some of the things that we read today, like especially around Ben Gurion, who I didn't really, honestly, I didn't really know much about, other than there's an airport named after him. he was secular, right? And so was
Yeah.
like Theodore Herzl. Herzl was like an atheist. And so these people are like looking to these texts solely for propaganda purposes. They're not looking to them for like divine inspiration. And that was one of the things that really stuck out to me in reading these and figuring out who these characters were. And like they create these political narratives, and Ben-Gurion himself fashioned himself as the Joshua of, of his generation, and that Herzl was, Moses. And I just thought that was really fascinating, because they're deconstructing this not to find divine sort of revelation. They're deconstructing this to how to like morally justify their violence against Palestinians and conquest. They're very explicit about it. It's not like it's hidden. And I think that's what's also the strange thing about this, is that this isn't like he wasn't really trying to like hide this. This wasn't some kind of like conspiracy or plot. It was like, we need to build a nation. We need a unifying factor. War can be a unifying factor, but war also needs heroes. There needs to be a romanticism of war. You can't just motivate people to kill just for the sake of killing. There has to be some kind of like elevated purpose. And from that, he created this sort of myth of a Zionist or Jewish warrior that was carving out civilization in these sort of hinterland areas, built upon this, propaganda narrative of like, we have to construct a civilization. We have to reconstruct, the state of Israel as it was imagined in these texts, not because God told us to do it, but because we are functioning, as an aspect of European empire. Like that, there's also that element of it too, and how it gets used. There's two kind of points to this, how Ben-Gurion, and maybe you have a little bit more insights on this, but how Ben-Gurion uses this text to say, the Book of Joshua is about two things. First and foremost, it's about conquest, but it's also about settlement. So the Nakba becomes the conquest, but it's not the end. It's not an event. Invasion, it's like we hear this all the time with the Patrick Wolf narrative. Invasion is a structure, not an event. And Ben-Gurion is saying, conquest is not an event, it's a structure, right? I think I flipped it around with the Patrick Wolf thing. Invasion is a structure, not an event. And Ben-Gurion very much agrees, with that kind of formulation, to say the Book of Joshua demonstrates that conquest isn't just about an act of war, it's also about settlement and active settlement. And it's also about incorporating and creating a unified ethnic identity or national identity amongst people who he did not believe were equal. Like in the realm of Judaism, he said we have to create a sort of stratified sphere that is literally created by geography. So at the center, in these metropoles, in these Jewish metropoles, will be the Ashkenazi, the European descended folks, ethnicities. And out from there, on the hinterlands of the frontier kind of spaces, we'll send the Mizrahi, or the Arab descended Jewish population. So he's like creating in this moment, when he's imagining the nation, he's not imagining, yes, there's a national identity, but it's also stratified, much in the same way of the European society and from which he came. So maybe we can like delve into that study group, because I'd never read something like quite like this, but I found it really fascinating.
So I think the study group has a lot. So we're talking about Rachel Haverlock's book, The Joshua Generation, and it's Israeli Occupation and the Bible. So this is, I rereading it in advance of this, because I had read it during this genocide. I read it, so I read it maybe a couple of years ago, early on in the genocide for the first time. It's from 2020, and I view the author. The author takes a pretty pro-Palestine perspective. I found, like, she's a historian. But like she understands this is an occupation. She understands that it's, justified using these concepts. But when I so the one of the chapters is called the Joshua Study Group at the Home of Ben Gurion, and it's 1958, and all the kind of who's who literati and important political figures of that time in Israel would go to Ben Gurion's house once a week, and they would read the Book of Joshua, this utterly genocidal text that we've just been telling you about. And they would read it, and they would talk about how important it is for Israel, and that's like the fundamental. Then she goes through the texts, but the story of this study group and like shows the centrality of this particular text, which does not belong in anyone's this text is. I don't think there's any text more genocidal than this text. I don't know how strongly I can denounce this, how much stronger I could denounce this text. There's nothing you could read in the 20th century from the most bloodthirsty dictators or mafias or criminals that would match the genocidality of the Book of Joshua. Anyway, superlative. It is. There's nothing like this in the world, and this was the text that the founding father of Israel and all his who's who friends were reading for lessons of how to make modern Israel. And again, biblical archaeology, history, these academic fields have created a situation where you're trying to research this, you're trying to educate people about history. This is it starts from these texts and goes out to try to justify these things. It starts from the settler colony, the genocidal apartheid settler colony that had committed all of these atrocities in 1948 and 36 to 39. All of these atrocities that they've committed, that they're now in 1956, they're fresh off of this war in 1956 and what they're doing in Gaza at this time. And they are creating the academic field. They're writing history in order to justify all of this and what they plan to do in the future. But the other element of this Joshua study group is they're kind of doing what had been done in the early 20th century and the 19th century at places like Oxford, the universities of that time, where they're also reading the Bible, but they're also reading the classics. They're learning Greek and they're reading, classic texts. Caesar's text about what he did in Gaul, also a pretty genocidal text, you guys. It is an absolutely horrific text of Caesar kind of blandly self-reporting the genocides that he committed against the Gauls in France. And all of these things, the Romans, the ancient Greeks, which is a lot of which is made up, and the Bible, these are all being mined in the 19th century and the early 20th century for inspiration for the kind of racial and colonial world that they want to bring into being. And so there's this combination of scientific racism and biblical archaeology and history and classics studies. And they're mixing these things in these very evil ways to come up with this kind of evil brew. And so where the study group ends up is not actually even where Israel is today. So where Israel is today is several generations now of education on that basis. And then we can talk a bit more about the Talmud and some of these other texts that the Israelis and Zionists look to for religious inspiration. But they have created an educational and academic basis for forever genocide, basically. And the other thing you said, you mentioned these parallels, because Ben Gurion sees himself as Joshua and Moses, but then they're constantly doing these parallels. So like there's a rabbi that I always mention in Montreal named Ravkin. His last name's Ravkin, and he's got a book called something about modern Israel. But he argues that Protestantism is the origin of Zionism. So in the 16th century or the early 17th century, there were some English Zionists who believed that Jews should go to colonize the Holy Land. And that's like the first mention of it. So Herzl picked it up from some of these 17th century references. And I think it's Ilan Pape who likes to say most Israelis don't believe in God, but they all agree he gave them the land. But the Protestants also use the Bible and the Book of Joshua in particular to see themselves as doing these parallels where their genocidal warfare is also based on the Bible. So at this point, like so many of the worst atrocities in history have come about from people following the specific texts of the Book of Joshua and related texts from that part of the Bible. And then, so we can talk about this other book by Philip Jenkins at some point, but I'll throw it back to you after those reactions.
No, I think what was just really profound about this is he's not, I mean, in some ways they were kind of like strategizing about this text, but it was mostly like a cultural war that they were waging. Mm-hmm. They had to construct a cultural sort of nationalism and identity from this. And this is why he brings in all, these archaeologists and, archaeology. I'm just going to say this like flat out, like archaeology is a bunk field. Like, we want to talk about fields that are bunk. Yeah. I'm saying this as a historian. I have tenure now, so like I can say things like this, right? No, I'm just joking. No. Trump is soon going to get rid of tenure, so that's a meaningless status, anyways. But no, I was reading this text from Thomas Jefferson, his notes from Monticello, his slave plantation. I think I sent you a message about this and how, Thomas Jefferson is largely credited as becoming the first American archaeologist and sort of creating a part of the field that becomes quote unquote scientific. He's examining these mounds in his slave plantation in Monticello in Virginia. And he's digging through these graves of Native people who lived there, and continued while he was actually excavating these sites, continued to pay respects to their dead. But the act of him just digging through these burials, some of which were like maybe less than a decade old, demonstrated that this is an ancient history, right? And by rendering it sort of this object, it's now becomes part of this sort of narrative and a myth, right? Yeah. By him just taking his little trawl, I think of like Thomas Jefferson in a sandbox with his little baby trawl, and then he's like digging literally the remains of human beings, and then that all of a sudden that becomes the kind of historical moment which marks a break between this ancient past for which you can do anything with, and this kind of modern future for which the nation state constructs itself. And I see like a similar, when I was reading this this text on the Joshua study group, these archaeologists were doing the exact same thing, and it's not this kind of like weird kind of like, oh, this is something that happened, in the mid 20th century post-war moment when Zionism was in its like funky stage. No, this was like happening like relatively recently. And if Sina's on, Sina, can you pull up that Middle East Eye article? Because I wanted to show this, the Israeli archaeologist who was killed by Hezbollah while examining an ancient site. His name was Ziv Erlich. He was, heralded by I'm just reading the headline here, heralded by the far-right Israelis as a pioneer of illegal Israeli settlements, and his presence in South Lebanon raises questions. So he was, I'm assuming, according to this article, was attached to this invading force, this IDF invading force in southern Lebanon to basically make up archaeological claims of greater Israel as existing, and thus justifying the presence of the Israeli invasion. So this isn't something that's like necessarily confined to the past, and even modern, like, to kind of put it into context in this moment in time, there's so many debates over archaeology of American Indian people, indigenous people of the North of North America, to the point where there's still scholars out there who take pictures of themselves next to skulls of Native people to show, like, to demonstrate this kind of like civilizational dominance, to say, like, this is the ancient past. These people have no rights. Whatever's in the ground is actually our history. You can see this playing out with a bizarre field of Mormon archaeology that is not just confined to the United States, but also is now taking up archaeological sites in places like Mexico, and looking at Nahua creation stories as actually demonstrating or confirming Mormon sort of scripture, right? So this isn't something that's like, just like confined to what we know as the Bible per se, but it serves political agendas in the present, right? So now this justifies Mormon presence in Mexico to convert these heathens who just misinterpreted this God figure that had arrived, that was their God, and now the serpent God, and it was actually the real God, the true church of they call it, I think it's called the True Native American Church or something like that. And so now it justifies this expansion of the enterprise, the colonial and economic enterprise of the Mormon Church into Latin America, right? So it's something that isn't just confined to this past. I think when people think of archaeology, they think of people like Indiana Jones,
Yeah, and that fighting the Nazis, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know if you have any more comments on that, because there's a lot of different directions we can go. I think
I have a couple. I have a couple of reactions. So yeah, this Lebanese, this guy who died in Lebanon. I think it's like when you see the rewriting of history or the creation of archaeology in real time, whether it's the Mormon example you just gave, or this fellow who died in Lebanon. The question I would want people to ask themselves is, why would you think that the stuff they did around the Bible or ancient Greece or ancient Rome would be any different from this? It's just that we're getting to watch this now. But I don't think anything that they did around Rome or Greece is less fake than this. I mean, I believe that there are these artifacts. I believe that I believe there are some chains of custody for some of these documents, but I think a lot of it is more recent than people admit. I think a lot of it is copies of things that were changed and manipulated over centuries for, again, specific political purposes in each of these times. And the other two little stories, there was an ad, again, early on, I think in the genocide. It might have been from even earlier, but it was like some Italian lady goes to an Englishman's house and he answers the door and she says, "This is going to be my house now." And he says, "What are you talking about?" And she says, "Jupiter, I'm a descendant of, from ancient Rome, and Jupiter said I could have your house." And the guy gets upset and she shoots him. And she's like stepping over his corpse, and she's like, "Anti-Jupiterite," right? And it's like the whole point of that is like to show the absurdity of the Zionist claim to Palestinian land based on God having given them the land. But it's like that, it's very difficult to help people see the absurdity of this. This was one, people try it in a lot of different ways and fail. This was one that I thought was pretty resonant. I was like, that's pretty good, like calling somebody an anti-Jupiterite. I thought that was pretty clever. But like in the early 20th century, in the lead up to World War I, in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, there were a lot of nationalists, and remember, this is where most of the people that live in Israel now are from. They're from this part of the world, Eastern Europe, right? But like people from Romania or Hungary or Serbia or Croatia, they would draw these maps of like the maximum extent of the kingdom of Croatia that ever had, or like the maximum extent of the kingdom of Hungary had ever had in whatever medieval time period, Poland, Ukraine, you name it. And then they would sort of say, this is what we, this is what we need to have now. And obviously, like the full extent of Hungary also overlaps with the full extent of Czech or Slovakia, and like they all overlap, and so they can't all have their maximum claims to the greater country that they want. But like that's all this is that the Zionists have done. They've gone back and they've kind of created a story that there was once this kingdom of this maximum extent, and the maximum extent of it, like they don't go back to the period when it was this tiny little thing or one little fort or whatever. They go back to the period of its maximum extent, even though it's every kingdom or empire over hundreds of years grows and shrinks. Take a look at the map of Canada or the map of the US. 250 years ago, you had a bunch of colonies hugging the coast, begging the indigenous people to help them survive, right?
Make America great again.
yeah, that's right. So I just wanted to kind of mention those, like the way they use the past, the way they use the map, and I kind of just wanted to make those links. But I think we should go to Robert Allen Warrior's book, Canaanites, not book, but text that you sent me from 1989, Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians, Deliverance, Conquest, and Liberation Theology Today. And this was like such a nice text. And we can, I want to let you introduce it, but like the thing that struck me was like, he just, any human being will have a reaction to a text, like when I read the book of Joshua when I was 13 years old, and I was like going to Catholic school, and I was like, well, I better read the Bible. Like, I read things. I'm a Catholic school student. I should read the Bible. And I read the Bible and I was like, this is insane. I am not, I'm an atheist from this day forward. I don't want any part of this. That was my reaction. And like, it seems to me, Robert Warrior's reaction when he read the book of Joshua was like, we're the Canaanites.
Yeah.
So like, he just read it, and he knew from everything that he had lived, that from the point of view of, the people who were using this text for what it was directed for on him and his people, we are the Canaanites. He's like, we native people are the Canaanites. Like, come on, guys. We don't have anything, like, we don't have any part of this, like, conqueror's text. And that reaction was really, I'm just like, what if he's just like, why don't you try reading this as if you're the Canaanites?
Yeah, it's I actually this text was recommended, I think, in grad school, and I read it at the time, and I was just like, wow, this brings me back to my days in Bible school, because it's very much just really just talking about the Bible. It's not really going beyond the sort of confines and reading the Bible as much as we are, sort of as a textual document or a piece of literature, and like how does one identify with one group or the other. And what's fascinating, because liberation, he calls it he says, he opens the opening line is like Native liberation theology, Native American liberation, Native American theology of liberation has a nice ring to it, right? And so he's kind of making this point of like liberation theology has played a very prominent role in the Black freedom struggle and the Latin American social movements and things like that. But why has it not had the same resonance in like so-called like Native American society? Because even it does in certain like Native studies circles, it does. I mean, if you read like Custer Died for Your Sins by Vine Deloria Jr., he does mention the Exodus in that book. He's a theologian. He was trained as a theologian. He very much does speculate about these sort of stories, these biblical texts. It sort of incorporates them in, like, as American Indian, as one of the, the lost tribes of Israel or something, and has been exiled or alienated from their homeland and seeking, a return. And so Robert Warrior's kind of, in my opinion, having read like Deloria a lot and now returning to this piece, I think he's kind of writing against Vine Deloria a little bit in this piece, and writing against this notion of an exodus as a sort of liberatory kind of framework. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. I just want to jump in because he, like, Exodus, his take on Joshua is awesome, but his take on Exodus is also awesome. He's like, we don't need Exodus. We don't want an Exodus from here.
Right.
We're in the promised land already.
Right.
And that's also so profound. It's like, and you're right. He's just like, Exodus does not speak to indigenous people, because we are in the promised land. We're in our promised land.
And he says very, clearly, it's like, at what point, at some point in the Bible, like, Yahweh or God becomes the deliverer, right? And then he becomes, in the book of Joshua, he becomes the Yahweh or God the conqueror. And this is he's saying, like, this is a distorted framework, because, like, if you read the Bible from the perspective of the Canaanites and not the perspective of those who are trying to destroy them, which we're implicitly sort of led to believe through the narrative of the Bible, that's who we should be defending, identifying with, right? As like, this is the narrative, because this is the narrative of God. They were, they were exiled, and they're returning to this land to reclaim it. And to reclaim it and to fulfill their destiny as these exiled people means destroying the people who lived there before, right? And so this is like, the commandment then becomes annihilation, right? There's no other way, as you pointed out, to put this. Like, I remember reading, I won't name names, but I had a relative who was arrested for something and then had to spend some time in a really bad facility. And he called me and he's like, hey, the only thing to read in here is the Bible, man. And he's like, I just read the Old Testament. And I was like, God was a dick. Yeah.
He's like, and he's always trying to get you to burn animal flesh and, like, striking people down and smiting.
But I think, like, in some ways, though, it's like, to kind of get back to this text, I was reading it, and thinking, and I actually, just as it's not very complicated. Basically, we've kind of covered the gist of this text, is that he's like, we should be identifying with, the Canaanites and not necessarily the conquerors. But I would actually say, I don't really think we should be identifying with the Canaanites, because that's a loser narrative. That's one of subjugation. And I think that this, as you pointed out, that this book actually needs to be rejected fundamentally. There's no a redeeming element of it. And I understand what he's trying to do. I'm not trying to, like, diss Robert Warrior or anything, but I'm just saying that it's like, I actually don't know if you can recuperate anything positive from this, other than to say that this is what they want. They want to turn you into a Canaanite, and we just need to refuse that sort of that subjectivity, because it ends in genocide, right? And I think even, you don't see Palestinians like turning to the Book of Joshua and saying, hey, we're actually the Canaanites, as far as I know. They're actually saying that this is not we refuse to accept this reality and this myth, and we're going to actually fight you and resist this exterminatory campaign. So I think in some ways, I just wanted to end with that, because I don't actually agree with this idea, because then we become the perpetual victims that are now, like, sort of reinscribed within this conquest narrative as the victims, and asking people who believe in that conquest narrative to identify with the people that they're inherently subjugating. I just think that's a false premise. So that's where I kind of stand on that. I think we need to kill the Cowboys, and this notion of a Canaanite as a perpetually subjugated and victimized people.
I'm all for that. He does one of the things that he says, like, really straightforwardly. I'm trying to find the reference, I can't find it, but he says the history is lost. And I just really like, I felt like this relief when I read that. I'm like, yeah, we don't have the history of what was actually happening when this was written. All we have is like certain guesses. And the idea, like you said, you know, like we've been saying here for the past hour, like the idea that archaeology can illuminate like what actually happened politically in this times, like, no, for that you need written records. And these are the written records, and these are not records. These were written at some point and edited and redacted and manipulated over time. And you trying to read what actually happened in these texts is a fool's errand. You know, there's some great other lines. Yeah. Where is it? Historical scholarship may tell a different story, but even if the annihilation did not take place, the narratives tell what happened to those indigenous people who put their hope and faith in ideas and gods that were foreign to their culture. So it's a little bit like he's not saying identify with the Canaanites. He's basically saying, like, you know, don't get in here. Don't get into this.
Don't use it.
Yeah, don't play this. Don't get played by this. And so yeah.
But he also says this like really strange thing too. I think it's on like the page 26 where he says, you know, he's like, he said, I'll just read it. He says, with what voice will we, the Canaanites of the world, say, let my people go and leave my people alone? And with what ears will followers of alien gods who have wooed us, Christians, Jews, Marxists, capitalists, listen to us? Oh, like I gotta, like, it's this whole thing that we are so exceptional that we don't that these are all foreign ideologies and this and that, and it's like it just kind of like nails on a chalkboard, because it's like the total anti-communist argument again that Marxism is a European blah 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 blah.
I you know, of course, you guys, Red Nation is like the exception for not having that, you know, that nonsense, which is really, really refreshing. But he does, I mean, you know, is he entirely wrong? I don't think so.
No,
because it's a rousing conclusion that he has, and he mentions like Nablus, Gaza, Soweto in 1980. So this is true. Like pretty cool solidarity.
Soweto too.
Yeah. And he says, we will perhaps, we the wretched of the earth may be well advised this time not to listen to outsiders with their promises of liberation and deliverance. We will perhaps do better to look elsewhere for our vision of justice, peace, and political sanity. A vision through which we escape not only our oppressors, but our oppression as once. Maybe for once we will just have to listen to ourselves, leaving the gods of this continent's real strangers to do battle among themselves. So it's a little bit nihilist that way. Yeah. I hear this often from, people, indigenous people around here, where it's like a little bit of like, oh, let's leave this world to the white man kind of thing. And I'm like, no, we're not leaving this world to the white man. No, it's also like this Bind a Lawyer writes about this in Custer Died for Your Sins. He's like this idea of like two worlds. He's like this is a complete fiction. He's like, we live in one world. We all inhabit the same world. And this notion that we live in like the Western world and the non-Western world, he's like, will actually lead to such alienation. He's like, people drank themselves to death believing this fictive narrative. And he even traces it back to these anthropologists who created this fiction to say like, oh, the cause for native drinking is because native people are just not allowed to live in their world, and it's like separate from ours, and it's this rarefied place of like of exoticism and this, and it's like, no, this is the material reality. And this is my case for Marxism. It's like you don't get through this by checking out or by withdrawing from it. You get through it by getting through it. Like you have to move through this world to get to that kind of like higher stage of human development. You have, like, there's no other way. We come as we are, to cite
Kurt
when
Cobain.
people talk about native drinking, I'm
Yeah.
just like, guys, like before the Chinese Revolution, a huge chunk of Chinese society was addicted to opium. Like
Right.
a huge chunk of Chinese society, because of what, like, because they were occupied, because all of their means of survival was being stolen from them, because their landlords and elites were abusing them. That's why people have addictions. And the addictions were cured by the revolution. They were cured. They had them, and now they don't. And so it's like, these are all material. And like, as to this whole, like, we have to just listen to ourselves. Like, I'm all for, like, it's a really good place to start, I think. Like, kind of the idea of intellectual independence, and the idea that, like, native people, or like indigenous peoples, have tremendous intellectual traditions to draw on. And they're not just
like every
having,
people.
and not just having to, like, take whatever is given to them. But I think, like, when you have established that independence and you have that confidence, you should be able to take everything that you want from anywhere. Like, it's a human intellectual project that we're all part of. And so you should be able to use whatever you need, including Marxism, which, is such a useful thing. Now, using whatever is valuable and discarding whatever is not valuable is also, that's something Mao said. People quote Bruce Lee as having said that, but it's actually Bruce Lee got it from Mao Zedong. Take what's useful, discard what is useless, add what's specifically your own. That's from Mao. And that is, intellectual independence for me. And I just wanted to say a few words about two other things I wanted to add before we kind of can wrap up. And the first one is about this book by Israel Shahak called Jewish History, Jewish Religion. And this was like an explosive book when I read it. Like, it was like circulating underground almost. Because Israel Shahak is like I don't know much about him, actually. He's like one of these people who knows a lot about Israel and Judaism and Zionism. And he was just like, he's kind of like the first person who kind of read the Talmud to me and understands, like, so he's like, look, you have the Bible, and you idiots read the Bible and you think that that's what Judaism is like the Old Testament. And he's like, you don't understand that the Talmud is like these thousands and thousands of pages of like ultra sophisticated argument back and forth that enables you, if you want to justify anything, you can be like, so the Talmud is basically like, it says this, but it really means that. Or no, maybe it means that. Or maybe it means something else. Or maybe it means the opposite. So he's like, when they want it to mean the opposite of what it says, that's what it means. When they want it to mean what it means, it means what it means. And so it's this, like, if you go to Catholic school like me and then you read the Bible, you have to be like, I don't want this. I don't want anything to do with this. I'm going to study science. I'm going to learn, how the universe works from a scientific perspective, whatever. But if you're Jewish and you go to yeshiva and you learn the Talmud, you don't actually have to discard anything, because you have thousands of pages of arguments to argue any point and stay within Judaism. And that's why Judaism can be like an identity, and they can take it up as a racial identity in the 19th century, because the flexibility of like this cast of people who study these texts and then conclude and develop a doctrine that justifies whatever they want, for however they want to use the Bible. And it's not just the Talmud, it's like the Midrash. There's a whole bunch of texts that they translate into these specific instructions and laws. But Shahak was and there's other books like Jesus in the Talmud, and there's other people who have studied this since then. The other the other thing I wanted to just mention was like this relatively weak book that I think mentioned at the beginning. It's called Laying Down the Sword: Why We Can't Ignore the Bible's Violent Verses by Philip Jenkins. And so he actually goes in a lot of detail about Joshua and Amalek and all the genocidal passages. But then he kind of says, like, here's how we can remain Christians and do this. So obviously we don't want to be atheists. So we have to kind of understand that these texts, so you can do it one of several ways. You can read it as a metaphor. You can read it as a caution. You can say that was all in the past and God's changed. You can say we've changed. You can say the world has changed. And like everything that he says you should do, I found really uncompelling. I was like, what? Why do this? I felt like he was challenging me to like go backwards almost, and I just feel so that, that my ultimately, like, where I land on this is, if you're fabricating history, if you're trying to read a set of words to mean the opposite of what they say, if you're trying to manipulate the facts of archaeology or whatever physical objects that they happen to find in order to justify politics today, like, no, stop. You're on the wrong. This is not the right way to do things. And so that's kind of like where I've ended up on all of this.
I have a lot to say, but I want to do a lightning round. I have some video clips queued up that we can sort of like comment on. But before we do that, I just want to say that I have a lot of native friends who are, Christians, and they identify, as Christians, and they kind of read their activism through their faith. Which I think is really great. Some of them are explicitly anti-Zionist, and others, I'm just really shocked that they never say anything about any of this stuff. It's like, now's your moment. Like, there's ever a moment to say something. Now's the time. And I think that's kind of like indicative of a larger kind of swath of the progressive Christian or faith community, and the failure to really mobilize those sort of those beliefs towards towards justice and action, so but yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's just like, as you were talking, it's like, there are ways that people can use these can use religion, can use spirituality for to really inspire them to take action. But there's also ways that I feel like you've explicitly made a career out of identifying as this one thing. And that in the moment, in time, if there's ever a moment in time, and you can't get worse than a genocide in terms of crimes against humanity. This is the moment to really come out. And I've been shocked at the failure to, specifically within the Christian faith community, to really come together to like push and challenge this in really substantial ways. And it's very disappointing, to see. It's also, I think, I don't want to say that it's like the logical sort of conclusion, but I also think that it has pacified people in such a way to justify acquiescence or to justify not saying anything. And what I think what when I see things happen, or like things happen to me or people around me, what really disturbs me is when people say, they message you on Signal and they put it like a disappearing message at like 1 hour, and they say, "Hey, I saw what happened. Really sorry about that. Just know I'm standing in solidarity." And it's like, but that literally means nothing, because to stand in solidarity to actually means to take a risk, right? And to openly identify with, the person or people who are being attacked or whatever. And you just don't really see that in this moment. And in fact, you see the opposite of that. You see people using their faith to actually justify what's happening. And I think even the cynical, Christian, evangelicals who are right wing and, believe in genocide against everybody except for Christians, who are now like standing up, like the Candace Owens of the world, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, are doing so for very cynical reasons. They don't care about Islam. They don't care about Palestinians. They don't care about. Yeah, it's a cynical take. It's one that actually sort of reifies, the genocide in some ways, So with that, I want to move to like the consequences of not challenging this directly and not and not, and this is what you're allowing. You want to talk about, you are people of faith in this book. This is what you're allowing. So Sina, can you cue up the first clip? I believe it is of the Interior Minister of Israel, Smotrich.
עזה חרבה לחלוטין, אגב, פשוט מכיוון שהיא כולה תשתית טרור אחת גדולה מעל ומתחת לפני הקרקע, פשוט חרבה לחלוטין. אמרתי, אזרחיה מרוכזים מציר מורג ודרומה, במרחב הומניטרי שאין בו חמאס ואין בו טרור, ואגב, משם הם מתחילים לצאת במספרים גדולים מאוד למדינות שלישיות. זה אירוע שישנה את המציאות, את ההיסטוריה של מדינת ישראל, עשרות שנים קדימה.
This was a clip. He was speaking, I think, in the early sort of stages of this genocide about on Israeli television about leveling Gaza, top and bottom, whatever is above the soil, whatever is, below the soil, completely rooting these people out and, forcing, forced migration, essentially. Do you want to pull up the second clip, Sina, with Netanyahu?
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible. And we do remember, and we are fighting. Our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza and in all other regions in Israel are joining this chain of Jewish heroes, a chain that has started 3,000 years ago from Joshua ben Nun until the heroes of 1948, the Six-Day War, the 73 October War, and all other wars in this country. Our hero troops, they have one supreme main goal: to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said, never again. Never again is now.
Mitzvah number 604. So this is based on Deuteronomy 25:19.
That was from that clip was from
I think I saw that episode.
Yeah,
you guys
blogging
referenced,
from blogging.
But yeah, like that's a mix of Book of Joshua and Zionist post World War II messaging, right? Never again, using that to justify genocide as well. So it's always like the reading of history and then the reading of the Bible. Yeah, and Amalek, like it's a way to kind of code that genocidal intent so that it takes a little while to explain if you're not. But everybody in Israel knows what that means, right?
Yeah, and Amalek is the nation that was essentially who lived in the territories of Canaan that needed to be wiped out, right? So he's invoking the Book of Joshua in that very specific instance, and it his rhetoric is one of defense. Actually, it's this kind of defensive conquest. We either wipe them out or they're going to wipe us out, right? And so anything that we do is always in our defense, and that's you have it sort of encapsulated in the name, the Israeli Defense Forces, right? But they're invading, right? They're occupying. This becomes the conversation going back to that Ben Gurion study group where they're saying this needs to be an aggressive defense, right? This becomes the Israeli ethos of, quote, we are only defending ourselves, but it requires extraordinary acts of aggression, right? This is the same logic that was employed at the founding of the United States and the Declaration of Independence, right? These merciless Indian savages who inhabit our frontiers are waging, a war against us that doesn't distinguish between age and sex, and therefore our defense has to match the exterminatory or the projected exterminatory violence that Native people are enacting against us, right? So it's the final complaint against the British Crown to say you have allied with these people who want to wipe us out. And so if we read these genocidal documents, I would say there's a covenant around the original texts of the United States and the Declaration of Independence, if you read it as a literary text, it's one of crescendo, a polemical crescendo. And at the very end, the final complaint, and worst of all, are these Indians, these merciless Indian savages, right? So I think we see that today. It's not just, it's a culture, sure, there's a cultural element to it, right? But you have to, you can't just use dry legal justifications to wage a genocide. There's all sorts of reasons to do it. You have to have a cultural justification. You have to have buy-in from the society, the entire society. And that's why you see, despite the protests that are happening, they're not happening because they're against the killing of Palestinians. They're happening because Israeli society is exhausted from the war, that it cannot win, right? I think that's important to point out, that still, Israel is one of the most polled societies, European modern societies in the world, and consistently it's shown that there's no sympathy, with Palestinians and the genocide that they're experiencing. It's more so the exhaustion that Israeli society is kind of facing in this moment of time. So, yeah, I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts on this, Justin, or those video clips for the lightning round.
Well, just only that the first clip, because we already talked about Netanyahu's clip, but the first clip, I also, if you get into Kabbalah and you get into some of the ways that, and Kabbalah is comes from the Zohar, and the Zohar is this text from medieval times. So again, it's ancient religions and the ancient kingdom, but it's a lot of these texts are from 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, and so the Kabbalah is basically it's kind of believes in a collaboration between God and people. So if you do the right things, you can actually make God do things. So, I've come to this kind of conclusion that Islam developed the way that it did. And Islam basically means submission to the will of God. And when you look at when I look at Romans, the way that the ancient Romans talked about property, and they were property is absolute. You can do whatever you want with your property. It was always a little bit weird to me. Why are they so insistent on property? Until I realized property is slaves. They're talking about being able to do whatever you want with slaves. And when I was thinking about Islam and the way Islam emphasizes submission to the will of God, it's why would you emphasize that? And it's because I think some of the other religions that were around at that time were of the belief that you could kind of manipulate God, right? You can make God do your bidding. And so when I hear Smotrich talk, I think of somebody this is somebody who thinks he's God. He just here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen to these people. He doesn't, these are not people who feel bound by material constraints, whether you want to go with Nietzsche and it's unlimited triumph of the will, or just the Bible and Kabbalah or whatever, and say it's we can call down God and make God do what we want. In all cases, it's that unbelievable. It's an arrogance that comes from somewhere other than the material, thinking about things materially. And if it, to bring it back to the sit reps and the military reporting, where these kinds of beliefs hit reality is on the battlefield, and it's only in the military struggle that you actually have that interaction between material reality and the vaunting ambition. I'm trying to quote Macbeth from Shakespeare, which is another story. But the overwhelming ambition of Zionists, wherever they are, and imperialists. And so again, the resistance always says, you've got to watch the battlefield for how these things are going to actually evolve.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. I guess we'll just take there's a couple of questions in the chat, and maybe we can just answer some of these. But I saw one that came up. I think Sinekin put it up on the screen here. I'm trying to look for it. Oh, there it is. Yep. What alternatives to these settler colonial views on faith have gotten you peeps? Or peeps, like the marshmallow chickadees, from going down the doomer path personally.
You want to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay. So for me, like I said, science. I'm like constantly. I think the real, actual world, including the world of human beings, is really wonderful. It's like a wondrous, wonderful place. And like I remember Caitlin Johnstone has written some of these things. Like, she's a masterful tweeter, got a much bigger account than I do. Like, I'm sure people know who she is. She's in Australia. She's like really on the right side of almost every issue that I can think of, and like a lot of fun to read. She's really good on Twitter, but she kind of like writes about how wonderful it is, on here on Earth, and like how like all the wonderful things we could do if this genocide wasn't happening. Like, and she's written like about what she would do. She'd bake and she'd write and she'd go outside, and like all these things, and like so yeah, I'm a big fan of planet Earth and humanity, and all of the species and all of these natural wonders. So I don't ever run out of that wonder and feel the need for something else. But like I do find certain religious beliefs right now very inspirational, in terms of like when you look at like what the Houthis or Ansar Allah say, when the stuff they say on their Friday rallies, or like really religious scholars and teachers like Abdul Malik al-Houthi, or the late Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah in Lebanon. Like they were believers, and like they always go back to these stories, these Shia stories. They're important throughout Islam, but like the Shia are particularly inspired by these stories of like people fighting hopeless odds. It's always this battle in Karbala where Hussein faced the Umayyads, and like 70 companions fought a whole army. Like all of those things are, and they're just like, we have to do what's right. Like they'll say, even if the sky falls, we're not going to stop supporting Gaza. And that's inspiring to me. Even I don't know, I want to mention there's this guy, David Mastracci. He's like a reporter in Toronto, and people were threatening him online. He does this site called Find IDF Soldiers, like tracking all the Canadian soldiers who are going and committing genocide with the Israeli army and coming home. And he's like keeping a database there. And somebody online said, "Oh, I wonder if the Mossad's going to assassinate this guy." And he made a joke out of it. And then he said, he was like, "I'm being careful, but like, I don't care what happens to me while Gaza is suffering a genocide." And I was just like, man, like, that's just a person, that's not a superhero. That's just a person in Toronto like anybody else. And that's inspiring to me.
I mentioned this a little bit on the episode I had with Adnan Hussein recently, where we talked about indigenous spirituality and anti-colonial resistance, which you can check out on the Substack or at Adnan's Patreon. But I don't actually talk about spirituality on my show very much, or at least my kind of relationship with it, for a variety of reasons. One being, as soon as you start talking about indigenous spirituality, I don't even practice indigenous spirituality. I practice Lakota. We call it Lakol Wicho, which means just the Lakota way of life. There's no separation. There's no like all of a sudden like you have the separate sphere of like of like today we're just going to do eat. It's all integrated, right? It's an encompassing philosophy of how you should live your life. And some people that I know that I'm really good friends with are atheists, but still practice that in some ways. So it's and again, I don't talk about it because as soon as you start talking about it, it's like flute music starts playing in people's ears, and they just can't understand or care to listen to anything else that you really have to say. But also,
it's very exoticizing, right?
Yeah, and like indigenous spirituality is commodified. I talked a little bit about this in that podcast episode about how even our medicines are turned into drugs. You have this like hippie culture in the West of like taking psilocybin mushrooms, or you have quack psychiatrists kind of prescribing psychedelics as a form of healing, but it all derives, from indigenous medicines that are like very contextual, and you have this commodification, this drugification of our medicines. And I think it happens the same way with our spiritual beliefs. So I tend to not really like speak on this issue, but it is something that I have returned to consistently, reading books by Joseph Marshall III, he recently passed away. And in fact, when I returned to his writings, he passed away. I literally wrote a review of one of his books, and he passed, and I published it on my Substack. And I just found out, somebody's like, "Are you doing this in eulogy to Joseph Marshall?" And I was like, "No." And I found out that he had passed away. So it was kind of serendipitous. And then he wrote a lot about Crazy Horse. He was I think the best biographer of Crazy Horse, and he writes about how Crazy Horse had this vision, that he could achieve all these kind of feats of bravery in the battlefield, but ultimately he would be killed by his own people. People are talking about doomer mentality. It's he's facing an existential threat, right? And so to know that his weakness was his own people was kind of a strange reality to live with. But there's this moment in time where I talk about this in several kind of pieces and podcast episodes, but I'll say it again here, where he's organizing his forces against the United States government, and he's really kind of appalled by and horrified by this notion of soldiering as a professional occupation. It's completely detached from family. It's separate, completely as an institution that's only meant to kill, right? He's standing amidst the charred remains of his family and relatives. And he realized that this is not an enemy that has honor. This is not an enemy that has, any kind of remorse for what it's doing. This is a genocide. He has this really profound moment. He's like, we can't fight them the way that we fought our enemies of the past. And so the implicit in that sort of assessment, he has kind of two realizations. One that I think is important. It's we did engage in warfare in the past. Yeah. We were any human society, but also is confronting this kind of different reality, this annihilatory reality, that it had to be. They were waging a war, genocide against us. And so he was like, we can give them no quarter. We have to fight them in a way. It's not to be dishonorable, but it's actually to fight the reality of the situation. Right. And so he wages a really successful military campaign against the U.S. Army, but ultimately, is kind of forced into this situation where he gets assassinated because they've wiped out everything else. It wasn't sure he preserved his people, he protected his people, but everything else around him was destroyed to the point where they said he was surrendering. There's a debate about this, but he was taken to a fort and essentially assassinated by one of his own people. And I turn to that because there's a deep philosophy that he has in his own relationship to spirituality about the honor of fighting for one's people and defending one's people, and the way that you should carry yourself. And he himself was a flawed person. You should read this biography. It talks about the mistakes he made. He was stripped of his rank as a commander because of his personal decisions and that he made in his life, but nonetheless was still kind of represented the spirit of total resistance to this project that was very much grounded, in how he lived his life, how he interacted. It wasn't something that was separate from, he went to war and came home, and that was kind of the separation. It was like his war was with himself. His war was with his spirituality. His war was with his vision. His war was, not just the external enemy. His war was inside as well. And I think what he tried to achieve in his short, lifetime, he was only 30 years old, and what he had achieved demonstrates human capacity in moments of great, terrible danger, right? His world was literally being destroyed around him, but yet we know his name today. And I see the same thing happening right now in Gaza, that we know these martyrs' names and we will know them for generations. So that's what keeps me sort of grounded, is not to say that this moment is exceptional in any way, but it's the outcome of imperialism. It's the outcome of a time where there are no alternatives for the system but to destroy and to kill, right? It seems senseless, but it's actually a productive violence for them. They think it's scaring other people away from resisting, and scaring, showing other nations what will happen if they try to step out of line. But in reality, it's having the opposite effect. We're seeing this sort of spread, and we're seeing the cracks and the weaknesses of this empire. So that's what keeps me going. So I think that's all we have time for, sadly. But we do want to have you back on, Justin. This is a really great conversation. I recommend everyone watch Justin's sit reps. They're actually really helpful, very informative. You need to stop doing them and recording them on Zoom. That's my one critique. You look so much better in this platform, but if you're not a subscriber to the Anti-Empire Project on podcast streamers or on YouTube, do so now. You also have a Substack. I'm sure you can find it there. You're also on Twitter. But yeah, if there's anything else that you want to promote or uplift in this moment. One last thing, the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism had a podcast episode with Adnan Hussein about a similar topic. So we're all kind of in this, like, they call the Tanky universe or whatever. But yeah, do you have anything that you want to sort of uplift in this moment?
No, I just wanted to say, it's a little bit unusual in my case, just that the Substack and the YouTube channel and the podcast are all different. There's no overlap, so you kind of have to, if you want it all, you have to follow it all. If you want only one piece, if you just want the military analysis, just do YouTube. If you want the historical discussion, there's the podcast. And Substack, I try to write things about ongoing events. And we did mention, you did mention the kind of right-wing anti-war, or the anti-war right. I just did a Substack on that. I think I published it yesterday, and it was a painful research process for me. So if anyone wants to suffer through that with me, or not, read that because I did it so you don't have to, I think is what the young people say. Oh
shoot, we're streaming at the same time as Electronic Intifada right now.
We're competing. Yeah, no wonder.
Oh, what? Okay, I was actually going to try to use Thursdays afternoon. Well, I'll have to tell them to change their schedule. No, just kidding.
Yeah, right.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This is great, Justin, and we hope to have you back on soon. For those of you who are still listening, subscribe to the Red Nation podcast, Patreon, support us. We are 100% subscriber funded and supported. We do, we're having more folks on in the coming weeks. Next week, we're going to have on some folks talking about American Indian studies. I'm going to try to do a series on that and really try to recuperate the anti-imperialist kind of strand of American Indian studies. So be on the lookout for that. I'm also finishing an article on that specific topic, looking at the recent 12-day war, or so-called 12-day war in Iran. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you hopefully next week.